series. So Echo Effect Conversations on War and Environment is what's been bringing us together. And by us, I mean myself. I'm Ines Montalvao. I'm the program director for Artists with Evidence. And two speakers that have been with me and will be with me along the whole series of conversations are Colin Greer, who is with us here, and also Ali Akbar Mehta. Ali might join today. He had a bit of a setback. He's in a residency abroad. And so we'll see if he can still join the conversation for a bit. But today we have a guest. And I would like to say hello to Aga Pokrywka, and who is our third guest, or we had two guests in the previous conversation. So in a way, you're the third guest. And today we'll be talking about fermentation and basically how to cultivate transformation in times of crisis. And before starting, I would like to, of course, acknowledge that this series of conversations is supported by the Nordic Culture Fund, who was awarded Artists with Evidence with the Globus Upstart grant. And so we will have, this is the third conversation, then we'll have a break during the summer, and then we'll come back from September to November with 3 more conversations, which will kind of finish the series of conversations that we'll have. Why Echo Effect? For those that haven't joined the previous conversations, Echo Effect is actually the name of a collaboration that we are developing together with Colin Greer and Ali Akbar Mehta, which will be an art science collaboration where their work and their practice will be kind of recombined by AI. And we will take a kind of a critical look at the possibilities of AI and how it would affect and shape in a way like the contributions that we would have from both of them. Colin is a poet, a humanist, and would be great if you could say just a few words about your work. And if you want to also, I'm always the one introducing, so maybe you could introduce a little bit Ali anyway, and what this collaboration between the two of you would entail.
I can do a little bit of that. Obviously, Ali and I are just beginning a collaboration, so it doesn't have a form yet. It's in the conversation stage, and these conversations are intrinsic to the development of what we'll do together. Hopefully, there'll be a connection between poetry and archiving, and we'll discover that as we go along. I, in one part of my life, write poetry and plays, and another part, I direct a civil rights foundation in New York, which is active in community politics. The politics of community, not electoral politics, and the creation of partnerships on the ground in locality where people can come together and address their problems from their own experience of the problems. So I do that in one part of my life, and I do the art in another part of my life, and have been fortunate to be able to balance those two over a number of years.
Yeah, and then Ali, on the other hand, his work is has a lot of focus on archiving, and he has put together an archive called Purgatory Edit, where he has gathered more than 10,000 entries of video footage, like from news to home videos to short documentaries, things like that, that are showcasing conflict and war and violence. And what was very interesting for me in the beginning with this work was that he not only has this perspective of the conflict and the war, but also the peace side to it, because you can't understand one without the other. So there's this continuum of like peace and violence, and that's where you can kind of assess what you're talking about. So by recombining this video footage that he has gathered, so this archive and Colin's poetry, we're hoping to shape new narratives. And this conversation series has come up a bit like a parallel program at first, and now it's something that is informing what we might do with this project. So with having these guests that are bringing like unique perspectives to the topic of war and the environment, the hope is that it will also shape the outcome. So it might shape the poetry, it might shape the videos we choose to work with, it might shape it in unforeseen ways, I would say.
Ines, can I just add to this a little bit? Yes. The whole concept of the two concepts of war and environment, that the conversation that we're building and the art we're building together is not in two separate parameters. It's not war and environment. It's the way in which they interact. That war has an enormous impact on the environment. And the war in Gaza and in the Ukraine has already had more impact on the environment than many countries' carbon use together. And then the impact on environment leads to people in movement. And as people move, especially to places that don't want them, there is conflict. So the two are deeply enmeshed. And then you have the larger world picture, in which corporate interests, however one defines those, are deeply invested both in the weapons industry and the energy industry. And so we have to have a storyline, so to speak, that brings values about that into an actionable framework.
Yeah, and that's in a way also the role of Artists with Evidence. We're an organization that is focused on art science. So we're bringing them together and as a kind of a unified source of knowledge. So we're basing everything that we do on like collaborations with artists, scientists, and in between. So this is like the core goal also of the organization in aligning with these topics that we are addressing here. But maybe we can start off with the fermentation. And before I give the word to Aga, I would just like us to think a bit about how far back these fermentation techniques go. Nowadays, we think about fermentation and we hear talking more about fermentation. Everyone's drinking their kombucha or things like that. But fermentation is actually a very, very old technique. So we can trace back fermentation processes to as far as 7,000 before BC. So, and this practice was already common in really old civilizations like ancient Egypt. But, and of course, there's things that we also associate in terms of culture and our backgrounds, if we think about beer or wine and bread. So, but today I would really like to kick off this conversation with Aga as what the role is and what are the basics of fermentation, and how do you tell us, or how can you tell us that historically this has been a form of resilience in times of crisis?
Sure. Actually, when you started to talk about how old is fermentation, I think that fermentation, if we perceive it as a work of microbes, so like a microbial activity, then it's as old as life on Earth, basically. And then, of course, when humans appeared on Earth, they started to cultivate and get into the interaction with the microbial works and kind of tame it in a way with different techniques which affect, with the examples of food, for example, which you mentioned just before the moment. So in a way, there is this line which says that we all come from a stardust, and I would say that we all come from microbes. And but coming back to your question regarding like the basic elements of fermentation, which I personally find very important, is of course, first of all, preservation. Fermentation did come from the fact that actually not so long time ago there was no fridges, and in order to preserve food, fermentation, next to many other preservation methods, because of course it's not the only preservation methods, was one of the tools to, in the climates where food is not available all year round, fresh food is not available all year round, it is a fantastic solution. And you might also notice when you eat pickled food that it changes its properties. It has a different taste, and it also changes on different levels. Therefore, the nutritional values change a lot. So I don't know, when you ferment a cabbage, it suddenly starts to have much more vitamin C, and therefore, especially what I said before, in the winter time, let's say when you don't have access to vegetables or other sources of vitamin C, then it's a fantastic way to keep the nutrition running, even when it's not directly available. And then
even increase that nutrition,
definitely,
nutritious value
definitely.
Yeah.
And if food is fermented with care and attention, also it influences the, in a way, of the safety of the food, because if you leave I don't know, whatever it can be, let's say this cabbage, let's focus on the cabbage, everything cabbage now, just out there without like consciously and carefully fermenting it, then eating it long time after it was fresh, it's very hazardous. But through preservation, we actually make it like super safe to eat. And I also see the great value in fermentation, which is like economic, because through fermentation we are able to bring back to like a food zone, let's say, elements which would not be possible to consume otherwise. And I personally, in my practice, like a lot of this act of transformation of things which are not appreciated or are not considered through food, and through fermentation, bringing them back to the zone of something which we consume. But at the end, last but not least, I wanted to say the element which in fermentation is the most important to me personally, and it's a community. Fermentation, in, I would say, most of the cultures, according to how I experience it, was a community practice. And many types of fermentation, it's very hard to perform like alone. Sure, you can do it, but also many of fermented foods were also part of certain rituals or festivities that you do in a community. And it's very hard to separate fermentation from the community practice.
Yeah. And you have, for those who don't know, because I'm sure that some people have joined because they saw about this on your project, Ferment Radio. You talk about social fermentation, right? And when you talk about social fermentation, you're talking not just of course, you're talking at a community level, but you're also including a multi-species level, right, in the discussion. So what has been like your experience with having a podcast and bringing in all these different dimensions to fermentation that maybe most people wouldn't think of when we think of fermentation?
Actually, I have to say that when I said community practice, I already in default in my head had like a community going beyond human community, because fermentation in its definition is an interaction with other species than humans as well. So definitely multi-species community aspect. But coming back to the question you just asked, so my fermentation practice started from personal practice. I grew up in a family where fermentation was a common way of securing food and enriching the tastes on our family table. And actually, when I moved from Poland, where I am from, I started to miss some of these tastes. And while on the move, I was very much aware that I cannot take many things with me because I was moving a lot back then. But actually fermenting, it's like a flying circus. You can set it up in many places. You don't need any complicated gear. You just need to have a jar, which you can find in most of the places, salt and something to put into this jar, basically. And I never intended to keep fermentation as my like a professional practice. It's just somehow started to populate in a way my artistic practice, which kind of makes sense when you start to work with microbes. They like to colonize and they like to, you know, spread when the environment is friendly for them. And it turned to, I saw back then fermentation as a community practice. I would be doing fermentation workshops to bring various people together, to usually treat fermentation, hands-on fermentation, as an opening to topics that I saw fermentation as a fantastic vehicle to talk about. And also when people, you know, have their hands busy, the conversation interestingly flow like very smoothly and in a very relaxed manner. And it was especially interesting to me is that the crowd who is interested in fermentation is super various, because there are people who are into, you know, like healthy diet. There are people who are in traditional foods. There are people who are into microbiology. It's extremely, there are, I don't know, people who are doing it for many years and they just want to hang out with people who also do it. And to me, form the groups where this variety of people can meet was something very attractive. But then the COVID came and the community aspect was very limited. And this is how Ferment Radio, the podcast on microbial and social fermentation, came into being, which in a way was translating the concept of touching upon all the topics that I thought fermentation could be a fantastic vehicle and embodiment of, because I started from the notion that fermentation is a metaphor to understand a topic in a macro scale. But now I have this strong feeling that, or not feeling, it's embodied feeling that actually through fermentation, we interact and touch upon something which is really material. And however, on Ferment Radio, we talk about things, I find many of the practices of my guests exactly like embodied practices in understanding transformation through fermentation.
Yeah. And I think that this will, of course, tie nicely with other topics that I hope we can bring into the conversation when you're saying this angles of why people come to fermentation and why they gather around fermentation. But thinking about it as also part of heritage and cultural identity. And I think that's part of something that you want to keep alive, that you want to share. That's part of like having a more interesting society, you know, if we bring all these different learnings and cultural heritage from different backgrounds that people might have. But it can also be the source of conflict, right? And I remember very well when we met and we were talking, it was an exhibition opening and we met and you said that you had seen that I was working with something like a program, putting a program together on war and environment, and you wanted to tell me about borscht. And how that tied like with the Russia-Ukraine war, and how that was like bringing you also to this topic of war and environment. And we talked about that, and that's why one of the reasons why we started talking, and why I also thought that within this topic of war and environment, it would be great to have like different perspectives, and fermentation is one maybe more unexpected. It's not the first thing that people would think of when we're talking about war and environment. But this is something that we've been having already as topics in our conversations. And I think Colin can speak to that quite easily, because we've been talking about fermentation as a means to, in a way, fight scarcity, for example, and as almost like a resilience and a survival technique too. But we've also been talking about scarcity from this scarcity mentality, right, Colin, that we've been already addressing as something that is kind of imposed on us, or like kind of appealing to our survival instinct, but it's kind of an illusion, right? It's this idea of scarcity in the sense of markets and capitalism telling us, you need to get this. This is the last chance to buy this item, or you really need this. And so how does that affect, or how does that reflect as political implications of fermentation techniques, for example? But how does this scarcity mentality influence our way of responding to society and threats in that sense? And then on the other hand, how the real scarcity actually is the thing that led to, or that promotes fermentation techniques as a means of preservation, right? So I don't know if you'd like to comment on that, Colin. Also.
Yeah, I'd be glad to try. Let me start with the word. I find that fascinating as a person that sort of lives with words. Ferment is both conflict, as well as the ingredient of a process of creation. And religious traditions have the belief that out of ferment comes right behavior, that conflict cleans out the soul, so to speak. And for some, that's a benign process where it's about fermenting good relationships. And for others, it's a process of exclusion that claims space over others. And so the word itself, I think, is fascinating in carrying with it the value, the challenge of values. And scarcity comes into play here, because scarcity is in two modes. One is the actual scarcity that people experience. The other is the psychological scarcity that comes from the drive to belong. And belonging is how we claim to be part of something that's bigger than ourselves and deeper than ourselves. And we can belong in two general ways. One, I guess I've said this before, but one is what I think of as a benign goodwill way. Another is a malignant exclusionary way, inclusion versus exclusion. And so the belonging phenomenon is at the heart of our macro politics, that we choose sides, so to speak, from how we feel that we're going to belong or not belong. And belonging operates on a continuum of inclusion and exclusion. And the idea that we are either living with promises made and unfulfilled, or possessions or privileges we had that are being lost. And politics tends to be a clash of movements built around those two themes. You promised me this and we didn't get it, or I had that and you've taken it away from me. And so we exclude on the basis of reclaiming what feels lost, or we call for inclusion to fulfill promises. And that challenge is the is the fermentation, the stew out of which politics is made. And it operates at the local level, and it operates at the transnational level, and it operates on the scale that's invisible to us. In many ways, there are decision makers and interests that superimpose on ours and call on our sense of belongingness to be attracted to one or another of those macro stories. And in a sense, when you talk about narrative, Ines, we're in a contest of narrative. Everything is narrative. Every word we use is a metaphor. It's not the real thing. So we're challenged to keep fermenting the ideas and values that we try to live by. And this is where art comes in a way. Belonging and scarcity psychology creates boxes that we live in that control what we think of as common sense. And art can open or close those boxes. So that I'll just finish on the note that the art is neutral. You can have progressive art and regressive art. And progressive art, in my estimate, tries to open space, and regressive art tries to close down and make history the present, an understanding of history, memory as the present, not actual history, but memory, versus opening up the space to create new. So I think the word ferment, separated from fermentation and then understood in relation to fermentation, is extremely valuable.
Definitely. Yeah, and I'm thinking like all this that you mentioned, like in a way it shows like how much even fermentation and other, like other preservation techniques are in a way impacting like these power dynamics, right, in society. And then also it makes me think about resource control, like who, and by resource, we can talk about natural resources, we can talk about financial resources. So like, how do you see that this, these implications of the political aspects and food preservation in a way intertwine at this level of like, of resource control?
I don't know whether Aga would agree with this, but in a sense, as I hear you describing fermentation, Aga, what came to mind for me was that we're trying to ferment the impact of humans on the environment in a communitarian, inclusive framework, which is an experiment. The preservation that has been about privilege and exclusion is our history. We are constantly in the experiment of fermenting a new, more promising way to be together. And that's where the analogy feels very strong to me.
There's actually a really interesting question in the chat that I think would contribute to this. So we have someone saying that since Pasteur, fermentation has been a central interest in the biological sciences. It has led to the development of antibiotics and also to the production of insulin and new biologicals. How does the molecular, scientific, corporate, and technological uses of fermentation, this moved, enhanced or alienated social fermentation? And maybe, Aga, you would have something to say about that. Do you feel like this development and this kind of contribution to society, or also, of course, the corporate side of it, has alienated this sense of social fermentation?
So first of all, I would like to underline that I am not against science. I am very much into science, but many developments which contributed to big scientific-based revolutions, like, I don't know, antibiotics, let's say, the invention of penicillin, were actually not primarily copyrighted. They were in a way open source in modern language, inventions or discoveries that we can use penicillin to as antibiotics. And then throughout the system, which is very much focused on the profit measured in monetary value, we talk about phenomena as, for example, antimicrobial resistance and other really nasty impacts of overuse of antibiotics. And why I'm saying this is that many scientific inventions and uses of microbes, including fermentation, they start on a right foot, but kind of end up on the wrong one, or they have really dark side as well. And that's also quite normal, because I would like to normalize the view of like a dual nature of things. If, for example, using antibiotics is really helpful and it saved so many lives, it doesn't mean that, you know, you can exploit it maximally and that it doesn't have a dark side. And but regarding fermentation as a practice of preserving food and working with food, what I really appreciate in it is that it's extremely hard to commercialize it. Sure, we can buy kombucha in the shop and wine and cheese, but those are just kind of a staples of fermentation. There are so many fermentation practices that it's impossible to implement on a commercial level. This is one thing. And second thing, that it's very hard to own the knowledge that makes these products exist. For example, I've been just recently talking with people who in Mexico produce fermented agave drinks, which are called pulque. And they were saying how difficult it is to commercialize. It's basically impossible. And also, you will never get a diploma that, oh, I have a certificate to make this drink, or I have the certificate to call myself fermented. In contrary to many knowledges coming from like a cultural setup, I don't know, let's say yoga, let's say. You can have a certificate to be a yoga teacher. And if you ask me, can you have a certificate to be a fermentation teacher? Not, because the knowledge of fermentation is largely, of course, utilized by capitalism, and there are enormous profits coming from many line of businesses related to fermentation. But still, there's part of it which will always escape. And I really appreciate that part a lot.
Yeah, and I'm sure that someone is already kind of monetizing that aspect, in a sense, that become a fermenter or expert or something like that. But that kind of brings me to a thing that I would like to bring up to this conversation. We talked a lot about knowledge here and knowledge production, artistic knowledge, scientific knowledge, and the importance of indigenous knowledge and ancestral knowledge. And so, like, could you elaborate on how this indigenous knowledge and traditions actually influence this fermentation, this modern fermentation practices?
First of all, I would like to say that I am not at all a specialist in indigenous knowledges on fermentation. My view of fermentation is very much influenced by the Eastern European way of fermenting. And maybe I can actually relate it to a barsh story, which you've mentioned.
Yeah, definitely.
So I knew barsh, which is a fermented beetroot soup from my childhood and from my family. They do it till nowadays. I do it till nowadays. It's like a fermented beetroot soup, which you would eat for Christmas. Or like a winter season, and usually it's just like it's really just the water which is like coming from the fermented beetroots together maybe with some broth made from vegetables, and then you would put some dumplings in. And I thought that this is barsh, that there is no other barsh in the world. But some time ago, I learned that there is a whole universe of barsh, even without beetroot, which for me is like, if this is not red, it's not barsh. And it comes from much more like a Eastern, like mostly Ukraine these days. And so first of all, there are like multiple interpretations of dishes which have the same name. And it's extremely regional impacted because, for example, people in Ukraine who are living close to the seaside, they will add fish to their borscht. But people in the central part of Ukraine, they will ferment their borscht much more than in others, and so on and so forth. So it's really a mix of locally available products and local microbes if they fermented. So it's always a version of reality which is embedded in locality. And if I would describe through that, like if borscht is indigenous to Ukraine, and it officially is these days, from like UNESCO said so, I think that we can see through the example of this fermented beetroot soup that indigenous knowledge is always local. It comes from locality. And I encourage everybody to cook borscht, but you always need to know where it comes from and never try to own the story. And I think that it's the same with any other fermented dish, let it be kimchi or anything else, where it comes from and what people own the story, and for what people it has a cultural meaning besides this, that it's nice to eat.
I think that's also the beauty of fermentation. No, I don't know, Colin, if you want to say something.
Yeah. I keep thinking of the analogy, so forgive me, but I'm working on the analogy here. It's true of human relationships. I mean, people come together from their differences and ferment a new person. The person in the relationship is not the same person as the person that entered the relationship. In the same way that a child becomes an adult, and the child is not really present in the adult, but fermented into the adult. And Hallmark Cards has taken our drive to connect and turned it into a profit-making standard. So that's one way to think about it. On holidays, we send each other cards and we make money for the card maker. But what it lives on is our wish to be connected to each other in deep ways. And that depth can offer both, for want of a better word again, goodwill and a new person, or it can offer the chance to retreat into demands that you be who I want you to be. And so at the local level, we know how to make relationships. We know how to parent. We actually don't need books teaching you how to parent. People know how to do that if the conditions in their lives allow for the time and the devotion. If they don't, compromises get made and a different kind of person is fermented. But it's a similar process that we become somebody different as we relate to each other. And that process can be commandeered, co-opted by other forces.
Yeah, I think that that's just making me think about migration and how the forced movement, or even the free movement of people, and kind of maintaining like cultural identity during migration, and how this fermentation is gonna intersect with this. I think in a way that's also the beauty of fermentation, that you can have the recipe, but then even the microbes of a certain place where you are, they're going to influence the outcome, right? So if you bring something with you, even if it's a recipe or if it's an ingredient or if you source locally, it will always have like a slightly different outcome. And I think it's an interesting metaphor, maybe again, like you were mentioning, Colin, to this movement of people And we see that in response to war and environment so much. So kind of, how do you see this intersection of fermentation with this movement of people and this desire to maintain their cultural identity during migrations?
You know, it's a similar process that Aga is describing. It depends if they're wanted, if they're welcomed. It's a very different environment to be welcomed and have your culture be the way in which you make a life and have people admire that they can learn from that, versus to be rejected and your culture becomes a defensive way to hold on to what you have as it's being denied you and taken away. So people in movement is the story of humanity. And whether the arrival is a benign arrival or a hostile one is very, very significant. Hostile in terms of natural resources and of other humans.
Yeah, it's what you were saying about inclusion, exclusion. It can kind of work in a way, both ways. Yeah.
Yeah. Ferment, the word itself is really a fascinating one, because you know the idea that I mean we're living in a time now where the far right Christianity, and not just Christianity, but far right religious, really welcome an apocalypse to cleanse the world of its evils as they see evils. And in that frame, the idea that we want to preserve, steward our universe becomes inimical to that larger idea that we need the end of days. So that there is a scarcity model operating against the wish for a plentiful model. It's enacted all through Bible stories. I mean, Adam and Eve is that story. You've got the fermentation of gender, and then you've got the taking in of fruit and what it does to the psyche. And then it continues throughout. The 10 Commandments, once that enters the universe, humans are expecting that they are capable of better behavior than they might have been subject to before. We're constantly fermenting our possibilities, both with technology and with a realignment of our values. A world without slavery is different from a world with slavery. An America slave-bound is different from an America without slavery. A world in which gender is regarded as not only equal but subtle, versus frozen and rigid. So we're constantly using ideas to percolate who we are, as Aga is describing with natural products.
Also regarding migrations, also those including people migrating because of war or conflict or other hostile, terrible situations like that. It is known from many migrant stories that people travel, for example, with seeds, or people travel with fermentation starters, and they have different ways to carry it with them, because food, including fermented food, is deeply embedded in the context. And context is made from many elements. It can be land, it can be a specific climate, it can be it is the people. And therefore, when people are displaced, in a way, fermentation becomes a way to preserve the identity and a vehicle for reenacting cultural traditions. And that's why, sorry?
And memory, I would say.
Definitely.
So
especially
kind of
the food
like...
and smells of food are very much related to memory, and to keep it up, it's so important. And I am currently working within Ferment Radio on a mini series which is touching upon this topic of how fermentation is intertwined with with conflict, and in a way how looking into fermented dishes or beverages as in a mirror, if we can understand more through the micro kind of a lens about the larger situation, which often is so complex, and because of how media represent these stories, it's so easy to get detached from what these stories are about. And I believe that through talking about war in Ukraine, genocide in Palestine, eradication of indigenous communities in Brazil, and so on, I really hope that through talking about food and relating to this through food and the stories of people for whom this food is very important, can really bring some more or less fragmented, less detached experience and understanding and comprehension of this very complex and difficult situations that for many are just stories, but for many people are real experiences. And from my experience, from my research and many interviews I already did on this topic, what I see as very common is that it very often touches on cultural appropriation. So for example, there are so many stories of Israel trying to own Palestinian, but also like a larger regional foods or ingredients, which for many people are important, but suddenly they are being rebranded as Israeli. And the same, coming back to my favorite borscht, beetroot soup, why it was even claimed by UNESCO as a national, like a heritage of Ukraine, was that even before the last war in Ukraine started, or Russian invasion on Ukraine started, Russia started to claim, or the ministers of Russian government started to claim borscht as Russian. And Ukraine respond with the application to UNESCO to, in a way, protect the soup. And I find it extremely symptomatic that few months before the war, the conflict about the soup open up or shown the emergence of this conflict and how it escalated so soon after.
Yeah. And I think a lot of times it's already a way of controlling the narratives that we are exposed to, right?
Totally.
I think that it would be interesting we've prepared some polls as we usually do, and I think maybe we could launch the first poll because we can get a bit of a sense of how people that are attending also are positioning themselves. So if you could launch the first one, where the question is, where do you believe fermentation plays the most critical role in times of crisis? And there's two options, and one would be building community resilience, and the other one preserving cultural heritage. So if the participants in the conversation would...
Oh, no, it's a single choice.
It was
I want to mark everything.
So it's, yeah. Most people have voted, and at the time it's seen most as a way to build community resilience. How many people? Almost all the people have answered. So yeah, that's really interesting. It was very almost 100% initially for the building community resilience. We're at I can maybe end the poll and share. So at the moment, 75% or so, yeah. So of the answers are building community resilience and a few preserving cultural heritage. And it's been interesting. We've always been giving only two choices, so kind of not an option to choose both. So did I?
Can I explore something with
Yeah.
picking up what Aga was
Okay.
saying? War.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, war is when we have used our words badly, when they are empty. Thomas Merton once said that when words become shallow and lose their meaning, and are bandied about, we end up with violence. And that's an exaggeration, but it's close to true. Using our words means using our words carefully. And war ferments, if you will, vengeance. It doesn't do much else but that. And when we talk about war, we have codes, so-called just war, which I think is a kind of an idiotic concept. And we have laws of war, which is also somewhat ridiculous. And then we have the terminology we use. So when you talk about Israel involved in a genocidal war rather than war crimes versus Russia in the Ukraine, which could easily be called a genocidal war, or the Allies' bombing of Dresden, acts of war which produce massive civilian losses. To use different language means to look carefully at why you're using different language. Otherwise, you ferment hostility. So I think one of the reasons why the genocidal frame is used with Gaza in relation to the horrific and barbaric nature of how that war is conducted is because Jews were subject to genocide. So it becomes a double irony and offers a level of disgust, because how could you not learn that lesson? That's what's contained in the use of the word, I think. But the actual phenomenon is akin to Modi against Muslims, Myanmar, Russia and the Ukraine, a fifth of the world, we've said before, at war, much of it ethnic nationalism is triumphant right now, and it's a if you will, a fermentation of identity against identity. And my hope would be that if people can learn to love other people's foods, to accommodate new taste, it might be possible to actually accommodate new people. It's kind of a bizarre thing that we colonize taste and can't take in the people. And that's a deeply human challenge.
That's yeah, definitely. I think that's a wonderful take on how we are willing, in a way, to assimilate things into our societies and culture, but not the people, right? We can assimilate food and some practices and things like that, but then we still there's still this strong sense of identity, and then there's of course all these narratives of like the threat of the other, right? Of what could happen if the other comes. And yeah, I would like to touch on the poetry aspect. Right before we started, we were talking a little bit, and kind of how do narrative, storytelling, and poetry, mainly in your case, Colin. I think if Ali would be here, we could also go into the archiving aspect and how it relates to this stories too. But like, how do this narrative, storytelling, poetry in the context of fermentation, resource scarcity, and resource control, and of course, like in this identity and othering aspects, can help understanding and addressing this the nexus of war and environment, which is kind of our topic also.
Yeah, do you want me to read a poem? Is that what you're saying?
That's a good response to
Maybe there's
to
one.
how can we address the issue, maybe through a poem. That's
Yeah.
a very good.
In a way, because that says where I am, because obviously poetry can be used in all kinds of ways, and great poets have been horrible people in many ways on these issues. Eliot and Yeats and some terrible stuff is written by them and wonderful things written by them. So it cuts either ways. And the movie of the Munich Games in 1936, is a wonderful cinematographic triumph. But what was it for? So art is subject to the values of the artist and the time. Anyway, this is called A Man and His Dog. He told me his dog was dreaming. He let her lie by his feet while she slept. One eye on me, he said, she needs to dream just like we do. Maybe past lives, herding sheep, leading the blind, and nightmares, leading sheep to slaughter, sniffing out landmines. He blew his dog a kiss following his thought about nightmares. I can see her reconstructing herself as she wakes out of a dream, not seen by others yet, not how she's known, like us.
Yeah, that was wonderful. I get stuck with the idea of dream and and imagination and things that we've brought to our conversations before when we discuss war and environment. Also language, like you brought up, and the reason why we call these conversations on war and environment and not on conflict and environment, because language matters. So yeah, any insights, Aga, also on how, because you also have in a way a practice that brings storytelling to the center stage when you do your podcast, for example. So how does the podcasts and other projects highlight kind of these diverse points of view, and how does it in a way foster resilience?
Sorry, I'm still in this poetry mode, so I slowed down. This is what we said maybe before about fermented dishes, which from cultures are sometimes, or even quite often, being used in order to strengthen national identities. And very often these borders of nations are not overlapping with cultural borders, which are much more blurry and international, transnational. I think it's it interests me, like maybe like this, maybe in Ferment Radio, and this is also what I was saying before we started to let our guests in. Thank you for being there, by the way. That I usually ask questions to my guests. I rarely express my own ideas and opinions, and I treat my practice as in the form of this podcast and having guests there in a way as fermentation. So I set up the conditions for something to happen, and asking questions is one of the way to introduce that. And I usually research quite a lot on the work and the of my guests before, and my aim is always to get different answers, because it's so easy to keep repeating the stories which we know about ourselves, about our work and what we believe in. But could we set up environments for getting different answers? And it's not at all looking for some blind spots and like, oh, I think that you are wrong, but like exploring this multiplicity and multitude of different topics, and kind of become friends with the complexity. And and be relaxed within the complexity, because I think that is very often that complexity makes us stressed, especially if we are in the situation that maybe we feel that it's expected from us to know. I don't know, maybe I'm a teacher, maybe I'm older than somebody in the room, or maybe for any other reason I should know better. I think it can bring quite a lot of stress and dissatisfaction to do not know, or change your mind, or admit that there could be so many answers to these questions. I think that this kind of attitude I exercise not only through my podcast, and it's also worthy to add that I always, however I lean to talk with people who come from academic backgrounds, for me it's extremely important to talk with the variety of people, because also it shows how different view on similar topics people from different disciplines and different experiences, also different age, have different cultures, and just not looking for the right answer, but looking for the complexity which we can comprehend, and how, because it's also, I think, understood the way that if something is complex, then it's not possible to understand it, and I don't buy it.
Yeah, me neither. I love that phrase, Aga, being friends with complexity. That's sort of what the fermentation food process is about, isn't it? And as an analogy for human life, it's a wonderful one. Friends with complexity.
I think through fermentation, and especially wild fermentation, meaning that you do not input the microbial culture, which is kind of cultivated. Especially in a wild fermentation, you never know what will happen. And even if you will follow the same recipe, you know, this much sugar, this much water, it will most likely come out totally different. And I think that's it. This is how it is. Yeah. And actually coming back to poetry and this revelation I had today, where are the links between poetry and fermentation? It's exactly that. If you read the same piece of poetry today, or 1 month after, or 10 years later, you will interpret it and you will feel it in a totally different way, because you are in a different place. And this contextuality and sensitivity to the context, which has enormous impact on how you perceive a thing, how you even taste a fermented dish, how you understand something, it's crucial. And I find this detachment from the context, therefore fragmentation, as one of the reasons why war happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, you said different in a month or 10 years or whatever in reading a poem. I think that's one possibility. Another possibility is that you add dimension. Right? You have the same but different because dimensionality is added, and it sounds like that's true of the food too.
Definitely.
And experience too, like lived experience. And I think that plays a huge role also. Like the person that you are at a certain age and what you've seen, what you've experienced keeps changing. And it doesn't mean that you are more enlightened. It could mean that you're went kind of in a direction that that wouldn't be so advisable, but still, it's always like, it's not just the context that you're in, but also what has happened to you, where you've been, who you've met, what kind of ideas and thoughts have started to immerse in your own views of the world and everything.
So you can end up 10 years later, whatever it's a poem or it's a piece of food or it's a person, you can end up both with regret and new understanding.
I was recently preparing a new material for one of the episodes of Ferment Radio, and it's not yet published, but I would like to share with you my memory of what one of the guests answered to the question of, we talk so much about extinction of species, but what is happening with the microbial species? Do they also extinct these days? Because there is not so much information about this. And my guest answered that no species is like a singular, separate from its environment entity. It's an ecosystem, you know, it has a whole microbial biome. It interacts with other species, whether they are microbes or bigger species. And therefore, we cannot talk about the extinction of a single species. It's an extinction of a whole ecosystem, including microbes. And that's it. I just thought that I wanted to tell about it, maybe in the context of the environment and the war, which comes also with the destruction of the environment, that it really works as a destruction and killing of the whole ecosystem, not only this or that. This perspective of like separating again and fragmenting things from each other is a laboratory derived perspective, which has nothing to do with the life outside of the laboratory.
Yeah, it's interesting. Similarly, we've learned now over the last several years that we as people, as sapiens, carry with us the genes of Neanderthal, the pre-sapiens, that we are a combination of what we thought was extinct. It's actually alive in us.
Yeah, and if we think about loss of biodiversity, so we're talking about war as a means to destruction, but even our agricultural practices have evolved in that sense of monocultures. And so all this diversity that we had at different levels in that ecosystem, like you were saying, it's also kind of constantly being threatened, even by, this idea of making producing more food and more of the same, and more trees to have paper or whatever. So we're always like thinking in this logic of more, in a way, and we lose a lot in that process, right? And of course, like war is then kind of a visible way to see, okay, this was like this, and then there was, or deforestation is also an easy way. So only when it's visible do we understand that. So I think fermentation brings us to this level of being visible also. Yeah. That is what creates this diversity, right?
Right. And war is permission to destroy everything.
Yeah, and it's at different levels. So there was something that we were talking in terms of a multi-species level, and I think that's an interesting take on it, like how can fermentation then be seen as a social practice, building this community resilience, but having in mind this multi-species level, so also the not visible, right? Mm-hmm. And I think maybe this is something where maybe with your projects or the people that you've come across working in these fields, maybe is there any example that you would bring from that, from all these conversations you've had that would make this in a way more obvious or more visible?
I see as a very important element of fermentation practice, hands-on fermentation practice, is what is very crucial to it is exercising the senses to feel rather than trust, I don't know, label of the product. One of the most common questions I used to receive when running fermentation workshops was people asking, so how do I know that I can actually eat it? And it is never a question when we buy food which is labeled with expiration date from the shop. Like nobody's asking, like, can I actually eat it? That actually in some cases it would be worth it to ask this question. But it's interesting that with food which is created with other species, and they do their part of the job, which we do not have control over so much. We can set up the conditions, but what happens next is a little bit, to me, it's still a surprise very often. I think that people often feel confused and insecure, and I believe it comes from this sense of intuition and using senses while approaching food is rarely being exercised, especially if for people who are eating mostly food like which is industrially produced. Like it really, we don't need to make this effort to use our senses to assess the food. And what I find very beautiful in fermentation and in my own practice, that it's like I exercise this muscle of feeling my food, whether it's good to eat or not, through my own senses. And I feel like in more processed diet, it's something that rarely has space to emerge. And yeah, maybe that could be a good example. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that the way that things are organized too is that people feel safe in a supermarket environment, you know, even if even if you can't smell an orange that is sold in a supermarket, people tend to, in a way, trust it. And then there is not much thinking put into, you know, if it's organic or not, or, you know, the source of this, what kind of pesticides were used to produce this food. Because it's there, then it's assumed to be safe. And I think this goes back into this kind of narrative that we are like constantly told. So yeah, maybe what needs to change is this perception, or people need to question more, you know. Just because the expiration date is there, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't question it, right?
Once you start questioning, and I embrace questioning, but the question has to go very deep. I mean, if in fact the orange, so to speak, or the perfume is affordable, is it affordable because children produced it? And if children produced it, what is that doing to us?
Yeah,
exactly. But this is what you said, that when you add this context, like who produced your food, then you add the context and it changes everything. If you take the perfume without the context, then it's something else.
definitely. I had one other poll that we had prepared, and I think it would give kind of a bit of a reflection on what we've been talking about. So maybe we can launch the poll. So it asks, like, in the context of resilience, where do you see the narrative of fermentation having the most impact? And the two options are in strengthening social ties and community, or in highlighting the importance of indigenous knowledge. And again, you need to make a choice. Yeah, and it's interesting because we were just talking about like how the narrative also influences like the way that we look at things. So maybe we'll wait a little bit more. It's kind of like half, more or less. And sometimes we get a bit of this feedback in the sense that, you know, some people would like to choose both or have a third option, but kind of the choice here also matters a bit. Yeah, so maybe I will end the poll and share the results. Yeah, so it's kind of balanced in a way, but it's still interesting that the most voted was the highlighting the importance of indigenous knowledge. And that might also bring us to what we were just talking about, like production, for example, and source and origin of things, and what kind of practices we are valuing. And in a way, like there's so much technology being developed to make us like cope with big issues with our environment, but a lot of it, it's like going back into ancestral knowledge, right? So kind of bringing in these practices and how people have been looking at them. I am gonna see, I think we had a question here that says, our gut ferments using a unique microbiome, which is an endogenous fermentation. How does this relate to exogenous fermentation and also helping people engage with social fermentation? Do you want to take that, Aga?
Sure. Well,
question, yeah.
Probably you saw quite a lot of news that the condition of our microbiome, meaning like the bacteria in our intestines, are having very big impact, and they are extremely related to our nervous system and brain gut axis, and there is more and more research exploring how the dysbiosis and imbalances in gut microbiome might be related to diseases which were kind of mysterious for a long time, like depression, or I don't know, even like Alzheimer and so on. And there is also a rising awareness about the fact that people coming from less privileged contexts, who do not have access to, or who cannot afford less processed food, they suffer from different kinds of inflammation in their gut microbiome, which impacts their health and therefore their quality of life. And that means that inflammation in the guts, which often comes from the life conditions that people do not have influence on, have extreme impact on the quality of life, and also what kind of even possibilities you will have in your life. I don't know, if you struggle with depression or other condition, of course it will hinder you, and therefore this changes the whole perspective on this external and internal, because what you eat, this is what you are, basically. And regarding social fermentation, how it could, how understanding of that could help people to engage with social fermentation. I want to believe that this deep understanding of relation to food and food diversity, microbially rich food and consumption of it has very big impact on how we feel and the quality of our lives and our health. I want to believe that it can strengthen the feeling of interconnection, meaning that I am not a separate case. This is what is happening to me, has similar impact on people who have similar diet to me, but also could, this is my fantasy now, and I've been always a promoter of like a DIY approach to fermentation and experimenting with this at home. And if you can bring people together to just, I don't know, do some whatever, some ferments together, then you go for it. And that's it. I think that my big fantasy is that even if one doesn't have access to high quality food, through fermentation, you can still make it a little bit more healthy than it is. Because usually industrially produced food, and I am not even talking about hamburger, but let's say vegetables which are produced in an industrial way, they are very much depleted from the values which food produced in more, I don't know, rich earth, which is not full of, I don't know, pesticides and so on, clean food. I really hope that through fermentation, we can bring it to the scope of a little bit more healthier, a little bit more diverse food, which is often missing in many contexts.
Yeah,
Yeah.
before Colin, just one note, like if someone wants to ask any further questions, please also write on the chat and we can still go into that. But go ahead, Colin.
I don't have an answer to that question. I was just intrigued by Aga reflecting my own feeling, which is I want to believe. And I think that I want to believe has agency. So both I want to believe and my wanting to believe has agency. And if people can believe, if people want to believe that other people are can healthily integrate relationship with me, with others, the world is better off. I mean, it's the Rodney King question. And Rodney King in California beaten by police. Why can't we all get along? Well, why can't we all get along? There's a large part of the human race that currently and at all times that doesn't want to believe that's possible. That actually has ideas that mitigate against that. So I think wanting to believe and acting in that belief, Gandhi's idea of being the future now, wanting to believe and living in the belief as best as one can, is important. It's hard to get there. It's hard to answer that question, the how question. And I think wanting to is part of it. There's a neuroscientist, Benjamin Libet, who has the concept of free won't, that we have the potential in our neurobiology to exercise a free won't. We may not have free will, but we have free won't. And frequently it's the won't that matters, I think. That, I won't be caught doing that. I won't do that. Which means I will do something else, and which is more benign than what you're not disallowing yourself. So I'm a big fan of the free won't.
Yeah, it's interesting that you're saying that prevents you in a way from the how or answering the how. And I wanted kind of to bring the conversation to a closure in a way that we, having explored all this kind of interwoven crisis, like how can we imagine possible futures through practices like fermentation? So I'm sending you a how can we, and maybe it's just about the I want to believe, but maybe Aga, from some final thoughts on maybe what's the future of fermentation practices, and from Colin, a bit of insights on how this poetic and what are the poetic and philosophical dimensions of resilience in that sense.
I would also like to encourage our guests out there, the attendees. I wonder about your ideas, the answer to this question.
Yeah, we actually have one comment, I think, or is it a question? A comment. I can read it out loud. So it's about migration and dislocation from generational place and foods, and increasing global urbanization are causing a disconnection with ancestral knowledge and ways, especially with relationship to foods, resilience, and healthy life processes. So I think pretty aligned with what you mentioned before, and how food in a way can act as a way of interconnection, right?
But to answer your question, I will just wrap up what I already said before as like a keyword. I really think it's working with the context, extremely important. Being aware of the stories that food, different information come with. They always come with the story. And it doesn't mean that we cannot turn it to as our own, but it always has a story from before. And working with this tool, I think it has a potential to do very interesting things. I would wish this to myself and everybody else in the future. And embodiment, like embodied practices. So also not focusing on understanding that if I don't know it and if I cannot describe it in words, it doesn't mean that there's something wrong about it, because there are so many other ways of being, in a way that, for example, I had the pleasure to talk with many of people who are fermenting foods, and very often they are not able to give exact recipes to their foods. They just say, yeah, you just feel it, or 2 fingers, or this starts to smell like this, and then you cannot measure it. It's not objective knowledge.
Any insight on the poetic, philosophical dimensions of resilience in a way?
I think in many ways we've gone around that. For some reason, I'm thinking of a song. There's a Dylan song, "Knock, knock, knocking on heaven's door," and it's one song when Dylan sings it. The Neville brothers sing it, African American singers. It's a totally different song. It has such depth and understanding of human experience, and that transformation is what I think a poem can allow. People can take it in and have it be part of who they are and be re-expressed. And I think guideposts to the extent that one can actually have the presence of mind to act on them are to stay away from blame and shame, and to embrace inclusion. That when you feel like you can't include, it's a problem for you to solve, not to lay on the victim, so to speak.
Yeah. I would like to thank you for for this conversation today. It was really great to have you, Aga, as our guest, and of course, talk and again with you, Colin. I'm sure Ali would have really enjoyed this conversation and also bring an added layer to it within the archiving and the processes of, and how meaningful they also are in this memory as an archive, and this recipes and things that we can kind of pass on, and how it ends up being a way to keep this cultural identity alive, and community practices alive, and fostering resilience. So
community identity with a view to enhancing comity between communities.
yeah, exactly.
Not a defensive, regressive identity.
Exactly. Find. Yeah, so we'll, as I said, we will take a summer break, or kind of a long break between June and August, and then we'll be back in September, October, and November with more guests and more topics that will bring up some of these questions and some others. So I'm looking forward to continue the conversation in September. But thank you so much. If there's any final remarks that you would like to do, you're welcome also.
Just thank you very much. Thank you, Aga, for the conversation. And thank you, Mathilde, for making the technology work.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for the attendees to keeping up with us.
We'll be surely sharing once you have the series on Ferment Radio out about this topic. That will be something that we can also share on our channels.
Thank you.
That people will be really interested in following your work. So Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for the participants that stayed with us until the end. And we hope to see you in the next conversations.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.